Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Good afternoon. It's Susan Coffin for Attitude Magazine. Our guest today is Dr. William Dodson, MD. Dr. Dodson is a board-certified adult psychiatrist. He's, I think, one of the few psychiatrists who's specialized in adult ADHD for over 20 years. He has written extensively on how basic research on ADHD can apply to everyday clinical practice. He's currently in private practice in Denver, Colorado. He's received significant accolades for his work with people with disabilities, and his upcoming book is titled What You Wished Your Doctor Knew About ADHD. Dr. Dodson, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. His topic today is the secrets of the ADHD brain, what you need to know about the condition. The ADHD brain is just beginning to be understood. It's quite unique. The characteristics that we think of it are not necessarily those of the myths. And Dr. Dodson's going to talk briefly about some characteristics of the ADHD brain, and then he will take your questions. So again, thank you, Dr. Dodson, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Susan. The reason that this whole topic is coming up is that a lot of the non-medicine-based treatments for ADHD have failed to show any detectable lasting benefit. You might have some benefit while the person's sitting in the room, but quite literally they could take the research subject out in the hall and all of the benefits would have disappeared. They were very situationally bound. And so a lot of people have been looking around for a new way of understanding ADHD that would then lead to what you could do that actually would be effective. There is the growing recognition that people with ADHD are not so much damaged or defective as really having just a second different wiring of the brain. The 90% of people who don't have ADHD are referred to as being neurotypical. That's meant to very definitely address the notion that the other 90% are not normal or better in any way. It's just that their way of being neurologically wired is more common. And so consequently, the world is arranged for people who are neurotypical because they're the majority. The other thing that people have recognized for a long time is that the name that we have for this condition, frankly, sucks real badly. It describes the exact opposite of what people with ADHD experience. It's hard to call something a disorder that conveys so many positives, high IQ, great problem solving, cleverness, etc. Most people with ADHD are not hyperactive. It's somewhat unusual for a grown woman, for instance, to be hyperactive or hyperaroused. And so consequently, a lot of people rule themselves out just because they've never been hyperactive. Attention is not deficit, it's excessive. Most people with ADHD, even when they're on their medication, have 2 or 3 thoughts going at the same time. But the really salient feature, the most important one, is that ADHD is not deficit, it's inconsistent. Just about everybody with ADHD knows that 3 or 4 times every day of their lives, they will get in the zone, is the slang here in Denver, get in the flow on the East Coast. But they'll really get engaged with what they're doing, and when they do, they don't have any impairments at all. In fact, one of the standard questions I ask is, if you're able to get engaged and stay engaged with any particular task of your life, have you ever found anything you couldn't do? Just about everybody with ADHD, if they disregard their learning disabilities, will say, no, if I can get engaged with something, I've never found anything I couldn't do. Yet another reason why this can't be called a disorder, because I can tell you the other 90% of people are not omnipotential. They can't do anything that they can get engaged with. So it turns out that people with ADHD are genetically, neurologically wired to get engaged in a totally different fashion. There are 4 ways in which people with ADHD get engaged. The big one is if they're interested or intrigued by what they're doing. They can do it if they're challenged or competitive. They can do it as long as the task is new, novel, creative, but by definition, that one's time limited. and they can do it if it's urgent, usually a deadline or a pending catastrophe. So through interest, challenge, novelty, and urgency, they can get engaged, get access to all their abilities, and do really quite marvelous work. Perhaps the best way to see this is to contrast it to the neurotypical way of functioning. And there they use 3 entirely different ways of engaging, getting access to their abilities, and functioning. And the big one there is it's important. And it doesn't even have to be important to the neurotypical person. It can be important to their boss, to their teacher, to their spouse. They can do it if there's a reward. They can do it if there's a consequence for not doing the task. So one of the, again, standard diagnostic questions is look back over your entire life. If the task is only important, have you been able to make use of importance at all? And the answer is usually no. They have to be interested. They have to find it challenging in order to engage with it. They've never been able to use the concept of importance, much less secondhand importance, to get engaged with the tasks of life. There's a second feature that's found in literally 100% of people with ADHD, and that's what's called rejection-sensitive dysphoria. Basically, it's that people with ADHD are genetically, neurologically hardwired that when they experience or fear that someone might withdraw their love, approval, or respect, they experience it in a catastrophically painful emotional fashion. And so consequently, they can have some severe downturns in their life that are totally unpredictable. People with ADHD tend to lead very intensely passionate emotional lives. Consequently, they wind up trying to deal with this rejection sensitivity in 2 ways. Some people become people pleasers. They're constantly scanning everybody around them, trying to figure out what that person would like or respect, and that's what they produce. They do this so well sometimes that they forget entirely what they wanted from their own lives. The other way is that they stop trying and will not try anything unless they're assured in advance of complete immediate success and largely without any effort. Consequently, these people become what are known locally as slackers. They have tremendously capable people, but who just don't try. And this is usually seen as a motivational problem when really it's a way of avoiding the pain of failure in front of somebody else. The other place where people with ADHD find a great deal of pain is boredom, which of course is the exact opposite of being interested. If somebody finds themselves bored, their mind will go twisting off looking for something that is interesting in order to relieve the pain of being bored. If you ask somebody, what is it like when you're sort of trapped, you're bored, it's a cold, rainy Sunday afternoon, nothing's on the television, what's it like for you? They'll say, well, first of all, I have no energy. I just sit there like a lump, but I'm irritable. I just want to sit on the couch and not have anybody mess with me. And I'm pessimistic, negativistic, nothing sounds fun, nobody's any good, and it's always going to be that way. But luckily, they've also had 10,000 experiences that tell them just as soon as they get engaged with what's going on, their mood is good, they're positive, they're very engaged with what they're doing. And so what this reminds us is that we tend to focus on performance enhancement with ADHD, but the ADHD nervous system actually governs everything. Being engaged in something interesting, challenging, novel, or urgent also regulates mood, energy, self-esteem, even one's view of the world. The average ADHDer also has trouble with retrieving information. This is not always the case, and so it happens in about 90% of cases. But all information is just sort of tossed in there in the order in which it was received, and there's no way of retrieving it because there's no card catalog that helps you know where to look for information. People with ADHD can be so unaware of what they're doing out in the real world that they often look very cold and narcissistic. This is rarely the case, but it can certainly look that way because they're only interested in what they're interested in and that they're not really motivated at all by what somebody else thinks is important. They look very selfish sometimes. When really it's the fact that the whole word motivation has a totally different meaning for people with ADHD. The better word perhaps would be engagement. We all know that people with ADHD, and especially our children, once they're engaged in any particular task, they have tremendous motivation. Paul Winder said one of the diagnostic criteria for adult ADHD was relentless determination. So that it's really more a problem of can you get engaged and stay engaged rather than motivation. A lot of parents have found that with their children, they have a great deal of difficulty with discipline because rewards and consequences don't have much of an effect. Indeed, all of the research studies using behavioral management techniques have failed to show any lasting benefit. Which was a huge surprise to people. So what you have to figure is what do you do when rewards and consequences don't really have any effect on the child or adult? Well, the first thing you need to do is remember out loud that your child's a fundamentally good kid and not trying to misbehave or be difficult with you. Unless they're oppositional defiant, of course. So in order to make sure that your child's behavior is the best it can be, first of all, make sure your child has some help with their impulsivity by being on medication more often than not. Make sure that the misbehavior see if the misbehavior is only occurring when the child is off medication or even worse, in the rebound from medication. If that's the case, you need to think about augmenting doses late in the afternoon and evening. The other thing you need to do is you need to refuse to talk, argue, or discuss what's going on when either one of you is out of control emotionally. Timeouts work for adults and parents as well as they do for children. And so it really requires everybody to be calmed down and to have gotten some distance from the original problem in order for reason to be heard. You need to plan for difficult times, birthdays, large crowds, that sort of thing. Being rested is very, very important, and also having enough food. A lot of people with ADHD have such trouble with self-appraisal that they can't tell when they're hungry. But they still have really kind of difficult behavior when either they're tired or hungry. Again, make sure that the medications are right and the child is taking the medications. You also talk through the event in advance. Talk about what their goals are, what happened last time, and how they can attain their goals. And finally, you plan for exits. If things do get out of hand, what sort of disappearing act can you do? Make sure that the whole experience is a positive one for you and the child. Finally, sleep deprivation can be as impairing as the whole rest of ADHD. It used to be thought that ADHD went away in adolescence because the only criteria that they used back then was hyperactivity. And sure enough, in early adolescence, hyperactivity does dim down to where the person is merely restless. This does not mean, however, that ADHD is going away. What really happens is that the hyperarousal of ADHD shifts to the nighttime and becomes tied to sunset, so that about 85 to 90% of adults with ADHD report that right at sunset, when it gets fully dark, they get a burst of energy. And they also find that if they get into bed at a reasonable time, they can't turn their brains and bodies off to go to sleep at night. The average length of time that the average adult lies there wide awake is 2 hours or more. Consequently, there are two very good studies out of the Netherlands that show that adults with ADHD are as impaired by sleep deprivation as they are by the rest of ADHD. The treatment is to treat the ADHD, and usually with the stimulant medications. A lot of people say, well, that doesn't make any sense at all. But actually, what we're looking for is whether or not the person can take a nap on their ADHD medication. If they can, you know that the ADHD medication will not keep them awake at night, and in fact, quite the opposite. They'll help them calm down, slow down, clear their thoughts so that they can sleep naturally. This sometimes is something hard to really swallow for a lot of parents, and so that's why we do that no-risk trial nap to prove that the child's not going to be awake all night. So at this point, I'd like to stop and see what questions are out there in the audience, what you really want to hear about. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Dodson. This is always incredible to hear you just so succinctly describe the characteristics that everyone with ADHD recognizes in a heartbeat. One person here, speaking to your comment about being a people pleaser, Joy, says, quote, I struggle with being a people pleaser and yet being interpreted as selfish and cold. How can these two go together? I think most ADD people do have experienced both of those and do wonder, how that works.
The whole ADHD nervous system primarily is an interest-based nervous system, and it's my interest-based nervous system. It's what am I interested in at this time. And again, that's the only thing that an ADHD person can do, is what they find interesting, challenging, novel, or urgent. And so all of those motivations are momentary, and they're determined entirely by what's happening at that particular moment. Importance in the world is usually what we call second-hand importance, trying to figure out what's important to another person. If you look at jobs, for instance, just about every job, unless you work for yourself, is what does somebody else, the boss, think is important enough to pay me to do it? Schools are the same way. It's second-hand importance. What does the teacher think is important enough to teach and then important enough to put on the test? And people with ADHD have a neurology that just doesn't do importance. They know what's important. They like rewards. They don't like consequences, but it doesn't lead to them getting engaged, getting access to their abilities, and getting things done. And so because of that, they look like they're very self-determined people because they are. That sometimes gets pejorative in saying you're selfish and self-centered, when really it's just a practicality of their nervous system. They're people that usually are very caring people.
That makes sense. Yeah, absolutely. Questions about motivation. If ADDers respond not to the relative importance of something, but rather to their interest, a couple of people have said, well, how do you get people with ADHD to do things that life requires that aren't fun? Brushing teeth, schoolwork, budgeting, paying the bills, whatever.
Well, one of the best ways is to inject interest. A lot of things that we're asked to do in life are not particularly interesting. So one of the examples I use is of a physician colleague of mine with ADHD who tells a story on himself of how he got through med school. He was flunking out in his first year in the midst of gross anatomy, which is nothing more than memorizing 150,000 Latin names for blood vessels and tendons. And he was just bored out of his mind. Luckily, he had a teacher who took him aside and says, I think this is just so boring to you, you're having trouble. Let's see if we can't juice it up. So he asked him, well, when you were a kid, was there anybody that you looked up to? And he was expecting some baseball player. And he said, instead what he said was, well, John Kennedy, I just worship the ground he walked on, and it really tore me up when he was murdered. He says, great, I want you to imagine, because people with ADHD have marvelous imaginations, that you're an emergency room physician at Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas. They just wheeled in John Kennedy, and he's got a bullet wound to the neck, and you've got to know the anatomy of the neck cold in order to save Kennedy's life. With that, he had an emotional reason to care about what was going on. And that's one of the things we try and do. If importance and rewards don't help people engage, they don't help people make choices, how do people with ADHD get engaged, get to where they can choose among alternatives? And one of them is, what do you emotionally care about? You can use that to substitute for importance. These things are important, but they happen to be those few important things in which the person has invested their emotional life.
That's fascinating. That's probably part of the answer to the frequently asked question, which is posed here: what careers do you recommend? I think what you're really saying is whatever someone cares passionately about, something they'll be successful at.
Yeah, very much so. And so that's why a lot of people with ADHD are entrepreneurs. So that, one, they're not working for somebody else, they're working for themselves. And they're really good so long as things are new, challenging. Once the startup becomes something that's maintained, they generally move on to the next startup. The other job that is particularly ADHD friendly is sales. There's a study that's now about 25 years old that 3 out of 4 people who do outside sales have ADHD. And for them, it's really not the money that motivates them, it's the hunt. It's getting the contract and the competition with other salespeople. It's not so much how much money they make. So that's a very good ADHD-friendly job.
Right.
Medicine is actually, medicine is also a great ADHD field. I've got 150 physicians in my practice. Again, because somebody's bringing you a new, interesting diagnostic challenge every 15 minutes. If you happen to be presiding over a heart attack, that urgency really does kick in. So medicine is also a very good field.
Yeah, something that's where there's constantly a new challenge. There are a number of questions here asking about what we know about the origins of the ADHD brain. Is there evidence that it's different? Are there brain scans that have been done? What some people have asked in terms of wanting to have evidence-based way to describe what ADHD is to family or friends. What do we know scientifically about these differences in the ADHD brain from the neurotypical brain?
To the extent that we're able to do scans now, I think personally they're pretty worthless. If you give the scans to somebody who doesn't have some preconceived notion about what they're going to find, they really don't see anything. All of the standards of care from the American Psychiatric Association, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, specifically warn against doing functional MRIs, PET scans, things like that, because the science is just not there to support them. Really, you have to, if you're trying to explain yourself, I think that pretty much everything in ADHD can be subsumed under that notion of a perfectly well-functioning nervous system under its own conditions and can't make use of the standard conditions of the neurotypical person and that exquisite sensitivity to rejection and criticism. You can pretty well explain everything with those two concepts.
So it's not something you can see on a brain scan then?
No, it's not.
There's a new test a new scan that's recently been approved by the FDA, which I think there are a number of questions about that. Any comments on that new scan?
What I've read about it, I am unimpressed. It lends circumstantial data, but really ADHD is a diagnosis that is made by a carefully taken history and ruling out all other possibilities. So scans really don't remove the need for somebody who sits down, listens, thinks, does a good differential diagnosis, and basically follows the guidelines. All the rest of it,
Okay.
whether it is just spending an awful lot of money on something that's really, I think, unnecessary most of the time.
The question of neuroplasticity has come up. People are asking what your thinking is about the ADHD brain and how it changes or can change. What's your thinking about brain training programs and neurofeedback and other such programs that assert that they make changes in the ADHD brain itself and the way it functions?
The only one that I have firsthand knowledge of is the neurofeedback retraining. That's been around for 35 years. They've never been able to produce a single blinded study to show that what they do has any effect, much less actually changing the structure of the brain. So that one's one that's largely a belief system and not something that has ever been able to show that it's scientifically valid and has anything to offer. With the other ones, I don't have enough personal information to comment on those.
Okay. Coming back to focus, interesting question here from Walter, who says, why is it easier for me to focus if I have music or noise on in the background?
It's white noise, and that would be true whether you had ADHD or you were neurotypical. Being able to have only one thing that is coming in auditorily rather than 20 is helpful. So that's basically what it would be whether you had ADHD or not.
Interesting. Okay. Exercise, question about exercise. Does exercise play a role in treating ADHD?
If you look in the literature, there's a grand total of one study from Hofstra that shows that kids function better after exercise. So there's virtually nothing in the literature. But as a clinician, I hear it literally every day. The best I can tell is about a third of my patients have found that they can treat their ADHD almost as well as with medication through very rigorous aerobic exercise. And the trade-off seems to be about 1 hour of aerobic exercise for 3 to 4 hours of really almost normative level of functioning. So these people are extremely fit individuals. They'll exercise in the morning, they'll exercise over lunch, they'll exercise after work, and that's how they've made it through life. I get them when they get their ACL tear. They can't exercise and all of a sudden have an immediate need for some medication.
Wow, that's fascinating. So while they were exercising rigorously, they were able to avoid medication.
Yes.
Yeah, interesting. In a similar vein, or maybe not so similar, I'm not sure, there's a question about whether meditation, are there other habits in additional, shall we say, to exercise that might affect or improve one's ability to focus?
I know that a lot of people have been working on mindfulness training. That's something that's very, very popular right now. And again, it has to do with that lack of self-appraisal. And so it really is teaching people how to slow down, stop, be aware of what am I thinking, what am I feeling, what effect am I having on other people. Because without that ability to stand back and view yourself, you lack the ability to learn social conduct. You have to know what you're doing and what effect it has on other people so that you can learn what's working, what's not, how to do more of what's working, how to not do what isn't working. That's one of the reasons why that lack of self-appraisal is that kids with ADHD seem to make the same mistakes over and over again. It's that they're not aware that they're making any mistake at all. So I think mindfulness training has a lot to offer. Unfortunately, nothing has been published to my knowledge.
That's fascinating. So it's kind of it's not behavior modification, but it's an ability to be aware of one's own behavior in a different way, focus differently. Yeah.
And it's just slowing down, stopping, being aware of what's going on right now.
Do you, in that vein, do you think that working with behavior therapists is as important, or as a psychologist for children with ADHD?
Yes, that's one of the things that I think people misinterpret when they look at the fact that behavior management techniques have completely failed. It's important to say what they fail at. They fail to change anything at all about the three basic areas of function in the ADHD individual: inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. Behavior management doesn't change those at all. But that doesn't mean that it's not needed once you've been able to get a lot of this stuff under control with medication. A lot of people still then need to learn how to behave. They need to do some remedial work, and behavior management, mindfulness training, just learning how to slow down, how to behave in parties, that sort of thing, is very definitely a learned behavior. And so it is helpful, just not with the three basic areas, basic domains of functioning of inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity.
Got it. So it's learning to cope with those existing conditions that need behavior therapy. Okay, that makes sense. The question keeps coming up, and I'll try again. Does the ADHD brain change, or with, say, exercise or medication? Does it affect the brain in the long run, or is it only helpful insofar as the moment in which it's happening? Am I being clear? People are wanting to know if they can sort of fix their brain, I think, in a sense, with medication or exercise or whatever works.
As with so much in ADHD, we just have to say we don't know. What we know is that with exercise, the benefits do last. Again, there's a payoff of about 3 or 4 hours after aerobic exercise when attention span, impulsivity, and hyperarousal are pretty much normative. And people with ADHD can accomplish wonderful things. A lot of people refer to this as the Michael Phelps phenomenon. Phelps is somewhat public about the fact that he has ADHD. He has not taken medication since he started swimming when he was 8 years old. But he works out 6 hours a day, too.
Right, so and I think I read somewhere that he hasn't missed a single day of training in, I don't know, many years. So
Christmas Day, he's in the gym.
Right, exactly. During the life cycle, does ADHD change at puberty? Is it affected by menopause, hormonal changes? There are a couple of questions here which I'll combine in that one, again, about the ADHD brain over the life cycle.
Yeah, ADHD is pretty much the same wherever you catch it in the life cycle. What's different is us. A 13-year-old is very different from a 23-year-old who's very different from a 63-year-old. It's more what experience we've had, what developmental compensations we've made, whether we're lucky enough to have good supportive parents who help us along the way. So really, it's pretty much the same wherever you catch somebody in the developmental cycle, with the one exception being menopause. There are a number of women who have found that estrogen is absolutely necessary for attentional function. And so what you hear is they go through menopause and they immediately become worried about whether or not they have Alzheimer's, because the thing that it affects most is memory. Also affects the ability to do math in your head. and also to sleep. Usually sleep gets much worse. It's already bad, but it gets much worse during and after menopause. And doing some hormone replacement, I think, is a very good indication for the use of estrogen in women with ADHD who find out that they really aren't functioning and their ADHD medication is not working the way it used to after they've gone through menopause.
Wow. So, and the studies on hormone replacement, of course, are all over the place. So that's a tough one, I think.
Yes.
Oh, there's a note here from Becky Pearson that there's a webinar for ADA members. That is the Adult Attention Deficit Disorder Organization. A webinar on mindfulness training on July 31st. That's tomorrow at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. So check out ADA, ADDA,
Right,
if you're interested in that. Let's see. There's a number of questions about diet. People, you know this, people are always interested in natural supplements, fish oil, diet changes, anything that in your experience has had a positive benefit on your patients with ADHD.
Yeah. There was just a review of this in the Journal of the American Psychiatric Association back in March, and the only thing that has been able to show consistent value, and it's a very minor one, is fish oil, omega-3 fish oil. None of the studies were blinded or controlled, so really you have to sort of take them with a grain of salt thus far. But everything else has failed to show any influence, all the way from Feingold's original thesis. He had no evidence for sugar, refined sugar, being a problem. That has been thoroughly disproved. And all 60 studies that have looked at what we eat, what supplements we take, and things like that have failed to show that diet has any role in causing ADHD or in treating ADHD.
Not even high protein diet. That's frequently recommended for people with ADD. Is that?
And in two double-blind controlled studies, they could not detect any difference at all.
Okay, so maybe we all just feel better with more protein.
Yeah.
Person asking about the webinar tomorrow. This is not on the Attitude website. This is the Attention Deficit Disorder Association, ADD.org, I believe, that's holding that webinar tomorrow. Just let me interject that. Talking about comorbidities, people are wondering about depression and anxiety and their relationship to ADHD.
ADHD is the most commonly comorbid condition known to man. At any one time, 70% of people with ADHD are going to have at least one other psychiatric condition, and this doesn't, even get into the medical conditions that are more frequent. So that's really one of the things that takes up a good portion of the initial evaluation. It's not just evaluating ADHD, but everything else that's there. The most common condition associated with ADHD is oppositional defiant disorder, but that's closely followed by anxiety disorders. Somewhere around a third of people with ADHD will have a lot of anxiety symptoms. Tom Spencer at Harvard, however, points out that a lot of times it's smeared all over the place. He has what he calls multiple anxiety diagnoses. The person will have 2 or 3 symptoms of panic disorder, 2 or 3 of phobic disorder, 2 or 3 of social anxiety. It's not enough to reach a full diagnostic threshold. So you say, yes, you have this diagnosis. But I think he said the average person had 27 anxiety symptoms. So anxiety is a very big part of ADHD. And the real difficulty is in teasing apart what is anxiety from what is the hyperarousal of ADHD. The question I ask my patients is, can you tell me about your baseless apprehensive fear, which is the definition of anxiety? And if they look at me with this sort of quizzical look and say, I never said I was afraid, that's when I then start asking, okay, when you use the word anxiety, what are you trying to describe? And usually what they're trying to describe is the fact that they can't sit still, have to be up and doing something all the time, can't sit through a movie, have a hard time shutting off their concerns and worries so they can sleep at night. And really what that is the hyperarousal of ADHD and not anxiety. Of course, there's no reason in the world why people can't have both.
Right.
And often,
and when people have depression and or anxiety and ADHD, are they treated as is there a preference for the order in which to treat those, and can they both be treated separately?
Yeah, they're two different conditions, and they need to be addressed separately. I generally go with which one the patient thinks is the priority to them. If they come in saying, I'm so anxious I can hardly function. For me to go off treating ADHD means I'm not listening to them. So I go with what the patient says is the most impairing feature, and then come back and do the other one later. Soon, but later.
Some people have been told by their doctors or whomever that if they're treated for ADHD, they cannot be treated for anxiety, or if they're being treated for anxiety, they cannot also take ADHD medication. Does that sound right to you?
That sounds like nonsense to me.
Okay.
What they're afraid of, and again, they're letting their fears take control of them, is that having somebody on a stimulant is going to make anxiety worse. There are 5 studies of children with bona fide anxiety disorders. All 5 studies show that anxiety gets better on a stimulant medication rather than worse. Unfortunately, there are no studies of adults with ADHD and anxiety. But just from my own personal experience, I think they're going to be exactly the same. Stimulants do not make anxiety disorders worse. The same thing with depression. Right now, ADHD stimulants are the most commonly used augmenting agent to an antidepressant. If you start any antidepressant medication, 70% of people are going to get a positive response, but 30% will only get a partial relief of their depressive symptoms, and so we augment the antidepressant with a variety of things, and right now the most common ones are methylphenidate and amphetamine. And it's unclear whether this is truly an augmentation or the doc just missed the ADHD that was always there. That's unclear.
Questions about the correlation between ADHD and addiction. Someone points out that Michael Phelps is a self-declared heavy marijuana user and asks the question about whether self-medication is common among ADD patients.
Yes.
Not as an alternative to treatment, but just chronic addiction. Is that an issue with ADHD?
Absolutely. There have been a number of studies, mostly from NYU and from Harvard, that show that the lifetime risk of a substance use disorder in people with ADHD approaches 60%. In other words, more often than not. The heartening thing is that people who take ADHD medication have the same risk of a substance use disorder as does the general population. There's a lot of evidence that treating ADHD, in other words, medicating it rather than self-medicating it, is preventative of future substance use. So generally with the parents of adolescents, I tell them, look, your choice is not really whether or not your child is medicated. That your choice is whether I do it or his pimply-faced friend at a party does it. That's really your choice.
Okay.
The drug of choice is marijuana, and if you ask people why they like it, it's because it slows them down. They're self-medicating the hyperarousal.
You mentioned that oppositional defiance disorder is the most common comorbid condition with ADHD.
Yes.
What's going on there, and what's the best approach for that? And I guess the third part to that question is that there is a post here from someone whose husband continues to be highly oppositional well into his late adulthood. And she's wondering, does that trait, how is that trait best dealt with, and is there any hope for change?
Well, in the United States, oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder, which is the worst form of it, where you actually are physically harming other people or property, is viewed in a very judgmental way. It's bad kids, bad parents, or both. Everywhere else in the world, and especially in Europe, oppositional defiant disorder is viewed as, again, a genetic neurological condition that actually has a biologic marker. People with oppositional defiant disorder don't have metabolites of serotonin in their cerebral spinal fluid. So it is viewed, I think, rightly as a genetic neurological condition. There's very little research on medication, so this is going to be more experiential. But what most docs in Europe and the United States do is they'll start with one of the atypical neuroleptics, and in particular Abilify, Risperdal, and Zyprexa all have articles out there, usually on people with conduct disorder, the more severe type, but shows that about 75% have remarkable responses to very low-dose neuroleptics. The other thing that, of course, works is treating the ADHD. There are 25 studies that show that the treatment of ADHD with stimulants decreases aggression, decreases oppositionality, and I think most parents of kids with ADHD have seen that fairly clearly.
Right. Okay. A person, Ashlyn, is looking for your help in explaining ADHD to others in as straightforward a way as you've just done, in a way that encourages understanding, but so she doesn't feel as if she's making excuses for her behavior. This question has actually been posed by 2 or 3 people who really appreciate your sort of matter-of-fact description of what it means to have ADHD and are wondering, how do they best translate what in your experience has worked well to just explain that to friends, classmates, workers, people you work with?
Well, it is, as you have done, it's to make a distinction between an excuse and an explanation. In point of fact, ADHD, once you understand what it is, how to start managing your nervous system, more is expected of you, not less. Once you know that the real management of ADHD in the modern world is 3 things. First is to emphasize the word management. ADHD does not go away. It's genetic, it's neurological. You don't change your genetics or your neurological wiring with age. It's there for a lifetime, so deal with it. The other thing is, don't let people try and change you or tell you that you should use neurotypical techniques that you know have never once worked for you. Second thing is, level the neurologic playing field with medication. Don't go through life with one hand tied behind your back. Get everything that medication has to offer. And then the third thing is, learn how you get in the zone. In other words, work through your strengths. So many of the studies have found out what people with ADHD couldn't do and then demanded that they do it. And then were surprised that they found nothing positive from their study. The new way is just to carry around a pad of paper with you, and it's usually as you're coming out of the zone that you recognize that you were in the zone. Gee, the last 2 hours were tremendously productive. I got a huge amount done. You ask yourself, how did I get in the zone? Was it because I was interested, but more importantly, what in particular fascinated me? Was it because I was challenged or competitive? And what about that situation or that person elicited the competitive streak in me? And so on. At the end of a month, you're going to have 20 or 30 different techniques that you know from your personal experience work for you and help you get in the zone. It's what we conceptualize as writing your own owner's manual about how your nervous system works. The owner's manual that we all were given in preschool is an importance-based owner's manual that has never once worked. Each individual has to write their own owner's manual. It's stopping and saying, when am I most successful? When am I most productive? But also, when am I happiest? When am I most energetic? When am I most positive? It almost always is when you're deeply engaged in something that you find interesting, challenging, novel, or urgent.
Okay. A couple of questions about stimulant medications. There are 3 or 4 parents whose children just are not able to take stimulant medications because of tics side effects. And they're saying, well, what do we do? What can we do to help our children?
Okay. If the person had side effects at the very lowest dose tried, go down on the dose. Somewhere between 8 and 10% of the people are already overdosed at the lowest dose manufactured. Remember that the dosage strengths that we have out there were swags, scientific wild-ass guesses. So somewhere around 8 to 10% of people will optimize at doses lower than the lowest dose manufactured. About 40% will optimize at doses higher than the highest dose manufactured. So if you felt revved up on the lowest dose, try again, go down on the dose. There's going to be about 12% of people who are going to try both methylphenidate and amphetamine and just don't get a positive response, the 12% non-response rate. And that's pretty consistent from study to study to study. For those people, the first thing I try are the alpha adrenergic agonists, Intuniv and Capve. When those medications work, they have an effect size that's really quite robust. It's an effect size of 1.3. Anything over 1 is considered very robust. So that would be the first thing I would try, especially if the child had tic disorder, because alpha agonists are one of the most potent triggers and can be treatments of tic disorder. So you get a twofer out of that one.
Okay, so try the non-stimulants.
Yeah.
Try even lower doses of stimulants than maybe were originally tried, and try the non-stimulants. Right. Number of people still on the medication question have talked about coming off medication and seeing belligerence, anger, emotional behavior. Do you have thoughts about that?
Sure. That's called rebound.
Rebound, right.
And for about 45 minutes after a dose wears off, especially in young kids, you'll see exaggeration of the ADHD syndrome. They'll be more aggressive, they'll cry easily, they'll be much more emotional, they'll be much more agitated, etc. So what I suggest is go ahead and add on another dose. ADHD is a 24-hour-a-day condition, and especially if the kid has trouble settling down to go to sleep at night, I would see if the child, can take a nap on the medication. If they can, then I add on a second equal dose of a stimulant medication so that they're pleasant to be around over the dinner table, and so they're able to go to sleep at night, do homework at night, that sort of thing.
Okay. Ryan has written and said that he has, first he wanted to thank you for your previous webinar, which was incredibly helpful. He said that he has he and his wife both are taking long-acting stimulant medication during the day, which works for about 10 hours for him. And then on a busy workday, he says that leaves him 6 or 7 hours of enduring symptoms. But his doctor really doesn't feel comfortable adding a second dose unless he reduces the initial dose. And he's wondering, what can he say? What should he say to this doctor? Or do you agree with that? I guess he's on the maximum apparent dose of Vyvanse in the morning.
Well, if I were being smarmy, the thing I'd say is goodbye.
Okay.
Again, the doctor is not there to treat his own comfort. He's there to work with the patient. And again, the Problem is it's not FDA approved.
Right.
And there's very little out there, and somebody would have to really look hard to find the fact that there. In fact, I just submitted this paper, so it'll be a year before it's published, but 27 published double-blind controlled studies of doses over the FDA maximum dose, and the fact that it's very common. About 40% of people need extra doses and doses higher than FDA studied doses. But again, it's just not a part of most doctors' training.
Right. And I guess
he may want to get a consult from somebody else to help his doctor feel more at ease and less anxious with a second dose per day.
Last question. We're unfortunately running out of time here. Insomnia. Lots and lots of support from people on the webinar saying, to the insomnia issue. What's the best way to help their child sleep? I guess let's sum it up in that way, although there are many insomnia questions.
If the child is having trouble just settling down, what you see is that burst of hyperactivity right at sunset. And either the child can't sleep on their ADHD medication, or as with the previous person, the doctor just won't write a second long-acting dose so the child can sleep. Again, going to the alpha agonist, and again, treating the cause of the insomnia with an alpha agonist like clonidine about 40 minutes before the child needs to go to bed. You're treating the hyperactive, hyperarousal component of ADHD. It's non-habit forming, wears off in about 4 hours, so the kid's not drugged, have that drugged feeling in the morning, and it works very well.
Melatonin have any impact in your view?
Melatonin works for about a third of people. The question is, when do you take it? If you took all the literature and it would divide into 3 pieces. One of them says take it at bedtime. One of them says take it at sunset. And the other says take it 6 hours before sunset. It only works for about a third of people. And the thing to remind people is that what it's doing is it's setting the internal clock. So the first night it's not going to work. It works on the second and subsequent nights. So just because it didn't work the first night, don't give up on it.
Oh, interesting. Okay, that's great. So thank you so much, Dr. Dodson. As always, a font of information. Just so grateful to you for your time and knowledge and for being willing to share it with everyone today. Bye now.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.